Hello, welcome to our podcast. Today, again, we had Rich and Jerry on to talk about some of their experiences and some interesting topics. Um, we have a really good one, so we're really excited. We're really excited to share it with you guys.
Hope you guys enjoy it. All right, welcome, fellas. We're back again. We're going to talk about some good topics today. So, Hassan, you want to lead us up with some questions?
Yeah, sure thing. Um, so you guys. Combined have a lot of experience in the industry. So I actually
I
wanted to
guess a
get your
nice way of
take
saying
about.
we're old. Nice way of saying we're old, Jerry.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Thank
So
you.
I wanted to get your perspective on some tech stuff. Actually,
Hmm.
uh, there have been quite a few big technical achievements, in business. From like ERPs and database software and stuff like that. So I was wondering, and I have my own opinions about this. We could talk about it, but I was wondering to get you guys a take on what big technical achievements move the industry forward when it comes to project controls. Because we talk a lot about some of the like the obviously we talk a lot about P6, right, and some other tools. What are things that you guys have seen over your careers that have made a positive impact?
Hmm. Okay. Uh-oh. That's one thing I couldn't figure out how to do, by the way, was kill my do not disturb. But okay. So one thing that I've seen over the years that made a positive impact is cost schedule risk analysis, Monte Carlo schedule analysis, and in particular, uh, the risk driver approach, which is relatively new, maybe the last 8 or 10 years. Something's echoing, by the way, guys. So the risk driver approach, well, if you have the data, to me is really powerful in that it gives you the possibility of having a tornado and an S curve at any point in the schedule. Okay. So
Feed at the end.
when you switch from the activity duration ranging approach to the risk driver approach, uh, what that gives you back is much more actionable data, right? It gives you, like I said, you can have a tornado and an S curve at any milestone. So you can say, okay,
Yep.
well, the total project, I need 6 more months, but on the start of construction, it's going to tell you need 2 months, for whatever your P value is. And I found that to be really powerful in helping to add buffers to the P6 baseline schedule to account for the results of the risk analysis, right? And to me, that was a pretty big step forward when we were able to do that with a little more science behind it.
So, I've
Right.
read a lot of probably a lot of Hewlett's. When we talked about risk drivers
Yep,
methodology between
he's the creator.
activity based ranking. I've actually had these interactions and dialogues with a lot of folks
Yep.
to try and kind of hone in on the methodology, and I can see how this is going to taper off into another subject, not today, but at another time, just about risk-based driving versus activity risk uh,
Mm.
assignment, because I form my own opinion as well. Some of that risk driver method is selective, and it's only selective for criticality, for critical activities, is the way I've witnessed it, and that excludes the opportunity for other activities to not get ranked for the duration uncertainty. So
Mm.
um, this is the way I've seen it executed. Maybe it's
Okay.
misinterpreted, but
Yeah, to
um,
me, it's how you assign the risk to the activities. If you're running the risk analysis against your full schedule, which is the current kind of recommended practice, right?
mhm,
Uh, then everything can have uncertainty.
abs-
Everything can have
absolutely.
risks. Uh, and to me, that the actionable output is the most important part. So in other words, instead of this thing telling you that piping in XYZ unit is critical on the probabilistic critical path and the deterministic critical path. This tells you that, hey, maybe it's welder productivity is critical, or maybe it's piping delivery is critical, whatever the risk is. And then you can go do something about it. Right? You can assign that to somebody and he can go try to fix that problem. Whereas telling me the range based on the ranges I put on the activities, piping in that process unit is critical. It's like, okay, I hear you. Now what?
Mm.
Right? So to me, that was a pretty big, change. That when the probabilistic was important, that gave you something to tell management when you're trying to approve a project, but the risk driver gave you something you can use for execution, the people can do something about.
But Rich, I guarantee you already knew what the drivers were and what the risk was before you run it through Acumen or wherever you was running it through. If your critical path is piping, you're going to look at delivery, you're going to look at fabrication, you're going to look at installation. You didn't need no software to tell you that.
Well, but what it gives you is interesting, Jerry. I don't know if you run, like if you use Safran is the one software I'm the most familiar with for the risk driver, and the old versions when you did ranging, it gave you something like it's called a cruciality index or whatever. Mm-hmm. The new, if you do the risk driver, it actually tells you, hey, piping welder productivity is adding 6 days to the critical path probabilistically. So it gives you understandable data. You know what I'm saying? It actually tells you it calculates in days, right? And you can do a sensitivity by turning risks on and off and seeing, what does that do or what doesn't it do, right? And it's also, since it's running against your base schedule, you can run it whenever you want. You can run it once a month or you can run it once a quarter. In the old version, I used to have to bring in an outside consultant with some secret software. I'm thinking of like Bill Barger's guys, right? They'd come in with their secret software and run it and give you an answer and then go away, right? To me, this is a tool you can use all the time. That's why it's a change, Hassan, a game changer. Right.
So, and I guess maybe it's exposure because the argument, and I worked with Jerry in the past when we were both somewhere with an owner company, and the SME there for risk, we kind of agreed that this is like the old perp master, like the risk, the activity risk, the based was no different than using the perp master with the codes. We would filter the codes and then rank it in the same way, and I was like, what's the difference? Because we were working with Safran and perp master, and it's the same thing to me, but it was our methodology that was capturing the same event. So maybe exposure to the Safran tool, and I like Safran; it's a good tool.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say, I could tell a story. I always tell stories. I was actually a user of what became Perp Master before it was Perp Master in like 1992. And we had it so early that we came up with an error that was like something or other, call Steve at extension 379. And I can remember calling Perp Master and saying, who the hell is Steve and what's extension 379? And he was the graduate assistant at Stanford that wrote the program that they bought it from. We still had those error messages in the program, right? So it was definitely not ready for prime time.
You used to have his number? You used to have Steve's
number?
We
would try to use it. They wouldn't give me the whole number. It was just because it was an internal number.
It was an extension.
Using it internally. You were using it internally at Stanford or whatever. But to me, that Perp Master to me was, that became Primavera Risk, right? That's the genealogy, I guess. To me, the risk driver approach that Hewlett came up with, and he's now pushing Safran, to me was a quantum leap. It really was a different way of looking at it. You could probably figure out how to do it in the old software, but the new software is built for it. It's just.
And I think that's,
now, the biggest problem I have is the data. Most of us don't have the data, right? Most places, most owners, at least the owners I've worked for, haven't captured that data. The contractors may have it and they ain't sharing it, right? But to do it right, you need data that the owners normally don't have.
And other like practical aspects, like putting in a ton of time and all those assignments and everything. It's like I feel like not everybody, especially you guys were just saying, like if you don't even see like a massive value to begin with, you know, um, it might feel like, okay, this is just another box to check, and how much time are we really going to spend on this to do all the intricate assignments, especially if you have a massive schedule, so maybe
Yeah.
that
Well,
plays a role as well.
again, another argument that I make for not having that massive schedule, right? So you have
Right.
something you can play with, I mean, and again,
Mhm.
you may want to have a independent level 2 or level 2.5 schedule that you do the risk analysis against, you do the what ifs for change against, and then have an execution schedule down below that, just with a way of mapping, so you know what's going on. But that's another. I mean, you would never do it with tens of thousands of activities. I don't think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
But
then,
but that was a pretty big game changer for sure.
yeah. Uh, do you have one, Jerry? So I was going to ask you, Jerry, do you have any examples of good technological achievements in project management? And if you don't, I would still love to hear the bad ones.
Well, I can't really think of anything that I agree with Rich. Having the ability to run risk on your schedule just about randomly at any time you want was a game changer. I agree. I didn't always agree with the results, but I do agree that that was a game changer. As far as bad technology, I don't know. SureTrack, maybe. I think that was kind of a waste of time.
Yeah.
Um,
You guys are gonna have to clue me in on that one. Was that a scheduling tool?
it was.
Yeah,
I'm
it was
trying to.
it was a Primavera spinoff of some sort for what
Right.
real short term. Oh, no, simplified,
Yeah.
right? SureTrack was simplified
Right.
scheduling, and then there was another one, Finest Hour,
Right.
Oh
that was
yeah.
for
And
turnarounds, minutes, trying to schedule in
Yeah.
minutes and whatever.
I can see
Yeah.
SureTrack. SureTrack wasn't bad. I mean, for what it was needed for.
All right, so that
Yeah.
explains it. Now we
I
understand.
my thinking is they were trying to come up with a tool that had at least close to the functionality of P6, cheaper to buy, and
Right.
it fell way short. But a lot of companies did get on the bandwagon for a while.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
how did it compare with, like, in terms of like market segmentation with something like maybe Microsoft Project? Like, was it trying to like bill itself as like even simpler than that kind of thing?
No. It was
No, I
a
was
P.
probably
It was
trying to compete. I think they were trying to compete with Microsoft
Yes.
Project.
Oh,
So
okay.
come
They
up
were
with a
trying.
cheaper,
Okay.
simpler version, strip some of
Right.
the bells and whistles out of P6,
it
and
was
and
it was
try to do
it
it.
was it was a like a P3 Lite, because P6 didn't come out till
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
2008.
still P3. It was still
It was
That,
still
P3 in those
P3,
days.
right? So it's P3
Yeah,
Lite.
you're right.
that's
Oh,
a good way
gotcha.
of putting it. Yep.
Yeah,
But
and it
Yeah.
just didn't.
I'll tell you the other things, Hassan, that I think have helped. But I don't have hands-on experience with them. Is some of these work execution processes and work execution software.
Mhm.
Uh, stuff like the Last Planner stuff. And the TAK. The location scheduling. The either the uh, TAKT, but there's another software for location planning.
Telos.
Is it Telos? Yeah, is that Santos Bot? I
Telos,
think
yeah.
is the guy. So yeah, Telos. So to me, that's a pretty powerful change, right? To be able to take your P6 schedule and then reconfigure it into a location schedule might help to make it more useful to the people in the field. The biggest problem with P6 is translating it to the guys in the field, right? because it's like might as well be written in Hungarian, or some other
Well,
obscure language, right? So for the guys in the field, I mean, it's really tough to use.
Yeah. And
my
like Cesar,
argument, my
oh,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
go
argument
ahead.
has always been, this is what you pay me for. If you'll just allow me to create a layout for the field, you won't have any complaints. But you hear it all the time. It's
Yeah.
too complicated. It's too much, and that's what good planners do is respond to those complaints and create layouts that makes everybody happy.
Yep. Yep. If you're wanting to take the schedule down to that level of detail, in the
Yep.
CPM, my concern when you do that is, I believe you get a lot of what I call preferential logic. You know what I'm saying? So
I
to,
use
to,
the
to,
same
to, to
term.
get it all the way down to the level of detail of week by week or whatever, there's a lot of preferential logic in there, and then it's really hard to explain those critical paths. Because if you got logic that's following a crew, and they're going to work in area 1 and then area 2 and then area 3, and all of a sudden something happens to area 1, and area 2 and
Yeah.
3 just went critical, and now you got to explain that to somebody
Yeah.
because of that preferential logic, right? That resource logic.
In
So
most, in my experience, Rich, the critical path usually always is exposed. You do sometimes have some of those near critical paths that are using some of that preferential logic, but in my experience anyway, the true critical path comes out. It's usually a no-brainer in most cases. You don't need software to know about it. It's everybody knows the critical path of the project with or without software. But
yeah,
the software now and the schedule adds detail to that, and challenges to help you, challenges that you have to overcome to achieve the critical path and keep it from impacting the finished date of the project.
yeah. Well, I'm not sure how changes that have occurred in the last X years that I think have made a big difference. Lots on the supply chain side. Well, just the simple thing of inventing all of the stock codes, right? So that everybody has a common set of stock codes they use. So if you're talking about a 2-inch carbon steel gate valve with certain trim and whatever, that's a stock code. In the oldest days, you used to have field engineers that were almost like translators.
Yep.
They would take some obscure purchase order and line number and translate that to the items that's on the ISOs, right? So the ability
Right.
to go to common everywhere stock codes and all of that stuff, that made the visibility of the whole procurement supply chain. And that was a big deal when they figured that out, and that was back when, probably 25 years ago or so, that all of a sudden everybody kind of agreed,
Right.
all the vendors, I think, agreed and said, all right, this is it. We're going to use these stock codes. And I can't remember. They come out. Did they come out of the military? I can't remember where they came from, Jerry. But that was like revelation. All of a sudden the fog cleared, and you could look
Yeah.
back up the supply chain and see, what's coming and when's it coming and how does that affect. That allowed you to put activities in your 3-week schedule 2 weeks out and know the material is going to be here.
Right.
Whereas before you were just praying, does that shipment include that valve I need for that ISO, right? So that was to me, that was a big change when they created that whole, and that kind of today, I guess, gets to the, would you say, digital twin world, Hassan? Is that kind of where that goes, to be able to track engineering, procurement, and construction
Right.
in the database, in the
In the model,
model,
in the 3D model.
in the 3D model. I mean, that was kind of the start of that, when people first, you were able to see, you were able to say, look, we want to work these ISOs. Do I have the material? Yes. Oh, nope. This one you don't have. It's coming in 2 weeks. This one, it's just shipped. It'll be here, whatever, and that was a big deal. That helped I think make the schedules more predictable,
Yeah.
by doing that. And the one area we did it years ago, and then we stopped. We used to, I worked for Stone and Webster, and we used to force engineering to give us engineering progress in terms of construction quantities.
Mhm.
So I didn't care how many foundation drawings they issued. I wanted to know how many yards of concrete were clean and could be built. And I didn't
Right.
want to have to do, QS type takeoffs to figure that out. I just wanted them to tell me this drawing's worth this many yards of concrete, or
Yeah.
this ISO is worth this much pipe.
I,
And we can do that now, right? You got all of that stuff
well,
now in the models.
somewhat. I've seen somewhat of that. They kind of backwards into it to make it quantity, so that they can reserve that for future benchmarking, for future estimates, right? So that's it's I've seen both, right? Engineering is based on drawings and man hours, and construction is based on installed quantities. So you end up in that mix. Some people do it well, others do it okay, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
But I mean, the digital twin should allow you pretty quickly to say, okay, I want to work these ISOs.
right, so the digital
How's
twin
the
isn't going to
engineering?
mature until you're 60%, right? At least 60% when you start extracting, when you actually have ISOs to provide, right? So that digital twin has at least a 9-month window before it's mature enough to provide that information.
Yeah, no
Yeah,
question, no
yeah,
question.
right.
But if you're doing near term work execution scheduling,
Mhm.
you're in that window,
Yeah,
right? I mean,
I
so
always
so
I always use that mall map. You go to the mall and you say you are here, right? I use that as an analogy of if you come onto a project, one of the first questions I ask is, what stage gate are we in, or where are we at on the project? Because that makes a difference of what you're asking for. So if you're asking
Sure.
for a digital
oh yeah,
twin, if you're asking for a digital twin, you just started in the conceptual phase. Good luck, right? But
yeah,
if you're
no.
already in, past the feed into detailed design, somewhere in the 60% of your model, then you're probably going to get a lot of good information, and then moving forward, even better. But
Yeah,
it depends
yeah.
what you ask, and I've seen that, right? It depends when you ask that question for what you're looking for.
Uh,
What I hadn't heard though, you guys mentioned some softwares that are breakthrough, and you talked about preferential logic and things like that. But um, Acumen Fuse Deltec, it's now a Deltec product.
mm,
That was revolutionary years ago when it came out, because it was pointing out the characteristics of a schedule that would point out schedule density, that was indicators of preferential logic, or even logic density where it's too dense.
yep, yep.
And
That
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 was
was a big.
that was a big turn. I mean, you didn't, other than Pertmaster prior to that would tell you if there was a lot of lags. That was the extent of our checks, was open ends and lags, and it gave us another view of how to analyze schedules based on metrics.
Yeah,
That
Yep.
give me
opened
a
I
up.
score. Yeah, give me.
absolutely agree.
I agree with you. When that started, people definitely had to change their behavior to try to improve their score, right?
Yeah, and then the
You
score
know,
got argued, because it was like, well, what are you basing your score on? Because
Right.
yeah,
not
okay,
everybody uses DCMA, and not in our industry
Yeah.
that
right,
well, right?
right.
And that I was one of those that was advocating for something that would work for our industry, not a governmental, you know,
Right.
metric that we're going to measure.
Yeah, yeah. I agree. I agree. So one of the problems with data and database and things, there's no standard in any of the industries of agreeing on, hey, these are the standard milestones we're going to measure, or these are the standard WBS we're going to follow, or code of accounts we're going to follow. And that really gets into the question of, do we have data to do some of these things that this new software can do, right? Because you gotta, I mean, even within a single company, like I worked for Chevron. So we had completed a zillion projects, like billions of dollars worth of projects, and had no data talking to each other. We had a whole group trying to sort through project data to standardize it and trying to get, you know, useful information out of all those gigabytes of data, So, in the future, if we're going to use AI and things, somebody's going to have to step up and standardize something. You come up with a Rosetta Stone or something that can translate, some kind of a software that can always translate and get it into the format you need for AI or whatever.
Because
Cause
Yeah,
that's one of the biggest tasks. Go ahead, Hassan. You
Oh,
work in this
sorry. I was just
space.
saying, like that's one of the biggest advantages of AI is that you don't it doesn't have to be in like a very specific, cleaned up, tabular format necessarily. But at the same time, that's actually what I was going to ask you guys next about the future, not just AI, but just like kind of where the industry you guys think is headed now. And I think there's a lot of questions about that, right? Because um, you mentioned a few other things besides AI as well, where the like I think that just in general we don't fully understand it yet, and so we don't understand all the implications. But what you just said, Rich, about the data, and I've worked with a few companies where they do have gigabytes of data, but they're in PDF files, right? They're not really
yeah,
uh, P6 is not going to be able to do anything with those, right? So, you need some kind of, natural language processing of some sort in order to really make use of that data, to the
yep.
most, in the most effective way possible. But I was going to ask you guys, like, this is obviously it's weird to ask for like a prediction, So, but what do you guys think about the direction the industry is going there, like when it comes to, techniques and tooling and things like that?
I'm hopeful. I keep putting this question out on LinkedIn and places. I would hope that some of the technical societies, so I'm talking about either AACE or PMI or CII or RICS, the quantity surveying guys, I'm hopeful that they're going to drive towards some recommended practice that says, because we always have the argument. Jerry and I talked about it on the last podcast. Do you have a completion schedule? And I have people that are horrified when you say at 75%, we're going to create a completion schedule. I mean, they're just horrified. Why would you do that? And other people say, of course, I'm going to have a completion. So I'm hopeful that those societies eventually are going to take the reins and say, here's a recommended practice for a project of this size and this complexity and blah, blah, blah. Here are some recommended things you should do, So I think if that happened, then we'd all start to standardize some way to feed that thing, right? I mean,
Well,
right?
there is a group that it does that, but we don't always agree with it. IPA.
Well, they only ask, right?
They do certain
They
things. They
recommend a
do certain things,
methodology,
Jerry.
right?
They do certain things with the data. I mean, the FEL index that they came up with, I think, was a great. There's a really important thing, Hassan. When IPA came up with the FEL index, and that included questions on project control. Do you have
Right.
control system and tools, right? So that was a full project look at, are you ready to move forward, right? So I give Ed Merrill credit. They came up with, that was a big deal. I think Hewlett coming up with the risk driver approach was a big deal. I'm looking for that next breakthrough in the work execution space and how you bridge from the project plan to the what are we doing next week space. And there are some tools out there that people are working on. You see them every once in a while on LinkedIn. I'm trying to remember the name of it. I'm hoping there'll be a breakthrough there. In allowing you to take the model and take your P6 schedule and somehow come with a weekly work schedule that's linked. That's fully tied in. So if all of a sudden you start moving things, it starts moving things on the big schedule, keeps them in sync.
Yeah, a real, uh, I guess, form of consistency across the industry.
Yeah, or at least segments of the industry. The
Right.
process plant guys do this. The guys building apartment buildings do this.
Do
The guys
this.
building
Right.
data centers do this. Just some at some level of agreement that this is the things you do. So there's not a pushback. Like I said, I've been on projects where I said, okay, it's time to start putting a completion schedule together, and people are horrified.
Yeah.
What do you mean? Throw away the schedule? No, we're not. A little more. Another way of looking at it. We're going to turn it sideways so we can look at it a different way. See what it says. But yeah, but
it's
I'd like to see the technical societies take that up as a challenge.
Yeah,
To get together.
it's. I think that would be best for everybody, but at the same time, I don't think anybody would want to, be the first to take the. Nobody wants to do the first step there. Everybody, at least that
Everybody
I've
thinks
talked to,
everybody thinks they have the perfect system. So
yeah,
why would I
it's
want?
like,
Yeah, why
oh,
do I want to talk
it's
to those other
proprietary.
idiots? Yeah, why do I
Yeah,
want to talk to
yeah,
those idiots? Right?
yeah.
But
But
yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. If we just kind of put that aside, I think everybody would benefit from that, right? If there was some just kind of standardized, and you could even understand, okay, here's how you apply it, and here's how you, I don't know, like modify it for like your unique situations or whatever.
yeah,
But yeah,
something. I mean, just to even. I mean, I worked a bunch of years for Bechtel. Okay, and Bechtel was very much a procedures and a standard company. I mean, it was pretty fixed. So every project that Bechtel ever did had this format of a project financial status report. I
right.
mean, you could go back to when the old man was building railroad whatever's back in the 1800s, and I think he probably sketched it out and laid it out, and they started doing it. It's that old, and because you had that, you had a lot of standardized data. Like for a short while in Bechtel, I was the chief planner here in Houston, and I was the owner of this, what was called the Red Book. And it had all this data from all these projects normalized, spread. It was called the Red Book because it was actually printed on red paper. And at that time, you couldn't Xerox red paper, right?
Oh, I see.
You couldn't. It was black on red, and you put black on red on them old Xerox machines, and you got nothing, right? Just an unintelligible mess. So it was
That's a
actually that way
perfect analogy for
for its
how
time.
pretty much
For
all
its
these
time,
companies think.
yeah. But within Bechtel, that red book, when you went and you took a project forward for a bid or a project forward to move forward, and you started spouting how many thousands of feet of pipe you were going to be installing per month. And they'd flip open the red book and say, well, hey, this says that nobody's ever done more than X. What are you guys doing different? What's happening that you're able to do 2X? And it'd be great if you had some of that data across projects.
Yeah.
The end plan guys in the UK claim they have some of that data for infrastructure projects. That guy Bjorn Lomborg claims he has a bunch of data, but again, I think it's public projects, infrastructure projects. But wouldn't it be great, if you had something like that? So you could
Yeah.
right off the bat say, look, this schedule is crazy. We've never done X thousand yards of concrete a month, right?
I think
Yeah.
it's safe to say that a lot of those companies, through attrition over the years, even if it was Bechtel or whoever started some of this methodology of collection of data, uh, they all kind of have their own, right? So if you go to each company or EPC, they'll have their own benchmark data that they go by. They've collected over the years, and they go against it and they check it. I've seen that, so that happens pretty much in a lot of places. It's just a matter of how they collected it. If they collected it, as built data, then it could incorporate inefficiencies that happen throughout the project if they're not able to separate the inefficiencies, right? So You
Yeah.
compare that totally towards your original estimate versus inefficiencies. It could be a little muddy waters, but it's still data that's relevant, right? Uh, for use of future projects, comparisons to future
Yeah.
projects or.
I think, that to me, if somebody took that on and tried to get people to agree on standards. I mean, even if it was as simple as, here's the 10 milestones we're going to measure on every project,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you could compare, how many months from the end of feed to start of construction or first concrete or first steel erection or when we start hydro testing, whatever. So that all of a sudden, if somebody come up with a schedule that was completely off the rails, you could say, how are you doing that? Just, I'm not questioning, are you doing it? But, what are you doing different? What's happening differently? But to me, that would be a useful thing in the future. If you could get some basic agreement, because it's really a problem when you have joint venture. When a project's big enough, you have joint ventures, and like I was on projects where you had Shell, Exxon, and Chevron, right? And they all got different benchmarks.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you drive yourself crazy trying to get a budget or a schedule approved. Because you'd get comments from all three of them left field, all different. Like, okay, now what do I do? how do I wrestle through this? And they all got to approve it, right? At the end of the day, they all got to buy off and authorize the project to go forward.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's to me that whole question of standard, and I hate to call it standardization, but at some level of detail, standardization would be a great thing
And
for
it's,
all
I
of us.
think, a huge thing also for, I guess, the next generation. You could call it, right. Like, as you get juniors into the system, right now the only people who have a really good holistic view are people who have worked at a bunch of companies in a bunch of different capacities, and that's the only way right now. There's no way, there's no, like you were saying, like your red book, way to sit down and just kind of, right. Like, also, Cesar, you could probably talk to this quite a bit in terms of education, right? Where, it's not completely straightforward when every company has a completely different set of, best practices and standards and everything.
Yeah.
That's why I think the vision for like AI or tools of this matter that one of the first recommended practices that was put forth by AXE for data collection, data analytics, is that the construction industry is lagging in this evolvement for those reasons. One of the major ones is a standardization of methods and probably an alignment on you know these subjects we're talking about, installation rates and
Yeah,
and all that.
absolutely.
If you
I
can't
mean,
get alignment, you never get there.
different companies have completely different definitions of what's a direct and an indirect cost. I mean, you want to start an argument, get a guy from Shell and Exxon in the room, start talking about what's a direct and an indirect cost. I mean, they'll be wrestling for hours, because they got a completely different view of it. And I'm not saying either one's right or wrong, but because they're different, when you're trying to compare their information, you need some Harvard mathematicians, to figure out how do I translate what this guy's saying and what that guy's saying and seeing if I'm in the ballpark. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it'd be great. It will probably never happen. I mean, this problem is as old. When I was back in college learning, I think it was statistics, the guy talked about, so we're going to build a gas station on this road. What do we need to know? How many cars are driving past with half full gas tanks? Well, that's something you can't find. You can tell how many cars are driving by, but you can't figure out that they have 1/4 full or half full or 3/4 full gas tanks, right? So, it's data you can never get. It just doesn't exist. And I think on the construction side, maybe we're hoping for something that we'll never get, but I don't know. We'll see. It would be that would be a breakthrough. The other wrinkle, with all of this digital twin stuff and a lot of the tech in construction, Hassan, is we haven't figured out how to compensate. If somebody came up with the better mousetrap, if some contractor came up with a real game-changing way of executing a project where they could shorten the schedule or save money or whatever, because all the contracts are basically around selling man hours, there's no way to compensate that contractor for his breakthrough today.
Mm-hmm.
There's no form of contract that says your engineering contract is going to be X percent of the construction cost. Whatever you do, go do, right? Yeah, there's nothing like that. So in some of the business, I see this integrated project development type contracts. I don't know. Maybe that's the answer, but I mean, right now, if say, pick somebody, if a technique figured something out that could beat Floor and Bechtel and KBR, there's no real way to compensate them. There's no form of contract that allows you to pay them for their innovation, in my understanding. And to me, coming up with new forms of contracting is what's going to drive your innovation.
So it's a political problem, basically.
I've heard the same, and I've witnessed the same on projects. The same argument that a contractor would have no incentive to finish any faster, especially if it's a reimbursable project, because that's how they're making the money in the first place. So,
True.
there has to be some kind of incentive of some sort that says, you'll get completion bonuses or something that would say, you finish this faster. There's something out there that'll get you.
True.
Right.
The best example is the Gorgon project, which I've talked about before. From the Chevron side, was a disaster. Way over budget. From KBR's point of view, it became a reimbursable contract. They couldn't haul the money away fast enough. So that was the most successful project in their history, even though from the owner's side, it was a disaster.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of that, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's why I think some of these we've lost Jerry on my picture. Some of these new, forms of contract maybe will change that. We'll give people a different incentive or a way to share or a way, because most of them don't want to share.
Right.
It's their proprietary data,
Mm-hmm.
so they don't want to share it. So if the industry could come up with, and I know CII was working on, they had one of those groups looking at different forms of contract and different ways of contracting stuff. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's that. I think we're going to need a breakthrough there, and then some of these new tools and things people will start implementing. Because it's in their interest, right? I mean, I've always said the holy grail that we've been searching for is how to align the contractor's goals and the owner's goals, right? And that's the hardest thing to do, right? Is to align those two. So if you could do
That one,
that,
to be fair, is a problem that's thousands of years old, I think.
yeah, absolutely. But what I'm hearing about these new integrated project things where they agree not to claim against each other, and there's a pool of profit that they're sharing somehow. Maybe, maybe, but that could be a breakthrough, and lead to adoption of some of these new tools, in my mind. But there's definitely people trying to figure it out with new tools. I mean, you see new tools all the time.
Yeah, and there's also in the I'm about to embarrass myself here, but in the civil construction industry, the way they do it now, somebody was explaining it to me. I don't have very much experience with it, but the way that they award contracts is through a very long process between usually the government and a contractor, where they hash out the details and and it's the legal stuff, but it's not in like an adversarial way. They do it where they're kind of building the schedule and the planning and everything together. So the people from I heard like Caltrans does this a lot, where they actually have teams that help with all of the planning, and they do it with the contractor to make sure that they're in very, very good alignment as they get into construction. So there's people kind of tackling that. Even like I said, I mean, I was kind of implying thousands of years old. What are we going to do? But you're right. There are actually some innovations there where people are trying to address it somehow.
Yeah, I mean, one of the best things I ever worked on, but never got fully adopted, was the idea of the open book lump sum, where you awarded a contract like a feed, and the contractor basically had his estimate was open book. That eventually you got to a point where the project was well defined enough that he was willing to take that as a lump sum. I mean, the unit price contract, think about it, where the quantity risk is on the owner, right? With a unit price contract, so he's just risking his productivity. This like kind of took that to another level and said, we'll leave the contract soft until we can agree on the quantities, down to the nth degree or whatever. So, I mean, I worked one of those. I thought it was pretty successful, but I never saw that again. It's like,
yeah, they're pretty
we
rare,
never did
right?
it again. It was like,
Yeah.
that was a neat idea. We don't want to do that anymore.
Because you mentioned it, Rich, and I read it on a LinkedIn post. I don't remember who posted it, but it was in regards to, I guess these industry project results, statistics, if you will, that say project overruns, right? But they're based on different surveys. So the definition of success moves, right? So the question is, what is the definition of a successful project? That's where it gets kind of muddy because
Sure.
If you started at a budget of X and then over time you've increased the budget by 30%, but you still finish the job, is that successful? Or is it successful because you just finished it? You know what I mean? It's people if the project's finished, they call it a success. But in essence, you have to look retrospect and then
One of the things we did in Chevron was what was happening, because oil prices tend to go up and down, but there's an upward slope there somewhere. Most projects were saved by pricing. In other words, the project economics was saved because the pricing of the products were higher when the project was finished than when it was FID. So we tried to do on lookbacks, unwind that. We tried to unwind pricing, the price deck that the project was approved on versus the prices they're actually selling for. We tried to unwind some escalation factors to try to normalize. At the end of the day, you spent X, but there was an inflationary spike in the middle of the job on steel or something, whatever. So we tried to normalize, but it was, we had some pretty smart guys working on that, but that was the pricing saved most projects, right? Because they had a conservative price deck when they approved projects. So when the pricing came in better, the economics was better. But yeah, what's the definition? I mean, so I've only seen one project where at the end of the project, when they pressed the button, it didn't work. So there's no question, right? That was a failure.
Mechanically didn't work, right?
No, it didn't produce the right product.
Oh, well, okay, chemically then.
There was some poison or whatever in the feedstock that they never stripped out, and it like I said, when they produced the first whatever, it was supposed to be blue and it was green. Like, the hell's that?
Right.
you
Well,
know, and
you know
that
that
went all the way back to feed. There was an error that was made back during the feed.
yeah,
But
I seen that somewhere, and I found the response, and I'm going to look it up so we can talk about it at another time. But he brought up a good point that the statistics came from different independent groups,
yeah,
these studies, and then at the end of the day, I was like, well, what is the definition of success? By the owners, from different parties,
yeah.
um, and
I'm seeing a
people write
whole,
books about this, right? There's
yeah,
books.
I'm seeing a whole thing now on LinkedIn and PMI also that are trying to push this idea of value, some kind of a value breakdown structure. And my pushback on that is the question of whether or not this project delivers value to the business isn't the project's problem.
Hmm.
So they're given a project to execute with a charter and a scope and a whatever. And whether or not that's the right project for the corporation to be executing, or whether
Hmm.
that project's going to catch the market and deliver value, man, you're putting something on the poor project team that, to me, I don't understand what's driving TMI, for example, to try to tell project managers to broaden their view and get into this whole value issue. Whereas, to me, they're struggling enough to deliver the cost and the schedule and the scope they were given. Now you're giving them a whole strategic question of, is this the right project, or is this the right scope of work?
Right. That's my
It doesn't make
opinion.
sense. To me, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
That problem belongs to the sponsor. If the sponsor approved the wrong project, God bless him. He approved it. The project's
Yeah,
going to go execute it.
yeah, that's on him.
That's on him. That you can't lay that back on the project team, and you can't expect the project team to push back and say, no, we really think that's a dumb project. We don't
I
want
mean,
to execute that.
we'll be out of work, right?
Yeah, I
Right?
mean,
Yeah.
to me, but I see this whole thing, threads of this through LinkedIn and PMI, where they're pushing this idea of a value breakdown structure and earned value. And I'm like, who is coming up with this? What ivory tower professor somewhere came up with this screwball idea? Because, the project team's got enough problems just trying
Yeah.
to execute projects, right? Trying to deliver what they were told to deliver, let alone trying to imagine how it could be better or different or shouldn't be done at all. It's just crazy. But there's a whole thing going on. I think PMI in their latest PMBOK or whatever, all of a sudden introduced this value business, and it's like, where did this come from? Who's driving for this? Who wants this? But don't know. But yeah,
So we're talking about earned value. Let's do a little switch up before we wrap up. We were talking about um, earned value produces the curves, right? Out of the curves is a contribution that came out of your remaining, so to provide a forecast. And some of the subject we talk about is doing earned value progress. What you hear, progress measurement is what derives your earned value that's calculated through curves, and then doing at a P6. And then we were talking about some of the fallacies, such as the any of the sawtooths. Once you have changes in budgets in both directions, changes the denominator, which creates a spike in the curve, which isn't represented in P6. And that's why, you know, personally, I recommend not using P6 for earned value. Use a tool that does work for earned value, but it's systematic errors is what it is. It's in methodology as well.
yeah, the whole thing with earned value is you have to be able to freeze
The baseline,
budgets, right?
the,
Freeze the base.
the
Well,
historical historical performance.
you have a original baseline, and then you have a current baseline that includes changes,
Hmm.
and then you have actuals and a forecast, right? So in most cases, my experience is people aren't very rigorous about keeping that intermediate current baseline. In other words, when I learned earned value, we literally had three schedules, right? You had the original schedule, you had a current approved baseline schedule, and then you had actuals and forecast. So there were actually three P6 files at a minimum, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when I've talked to people about that, I usually get a real quizzical look like, you have three? What's that second one for? And that's the one that includes the changes, that the
Right.
approved changes. And it includes the budget relative to the approved changes, which is a different number from the, what's in the forecast. So, unless you're really rigorous and really, really, solid on how you're handling that in P6, I don't think it works out like you were talking before. When you start deleting scope, all of a sudden you start deleting actuals out of P6. And that's a no-no in earned value. You maybe have to move it below the line, but you got to have it. You can't throw away money you spent or
Right.
work you did, right?
Those are the ugly workarounds. So we discovered those in 2009, right? So P6 came out in 2008, and then everybody thought it was pretty neat to do P6 progressing because the buttons were easy, right? So you have a new walk of life of users that came out from the woodwork and started doing these things. And as we studied it, we found out probably about a year later that some of the issues weren't preserving the historical uh, performance if
Mhm.
items were deleted. So that ruins the entire integrity of earned value in the first place. So already it's problematic. And if you're working for publicly traded companies, you know exactly why it's problematic because of Sarbanes-Oxley and all these things, you know, to avoid the accusal of fraudulent reporting. So and this is why we back then said, "Whoa, this is bad. This is bad. Don't do this. Let the schedule be the schedule. Let's use external tools for earned value." But it hasn't stopped. It just keeps continuing. People constantly are using it. Probably not even correct. It's probably inaccurate constantly. Now they do different sets of baselines, as you said, to differentiate between budgets that change. But then if you look at your contractual requirements, in the contractual requirements, you're held to a baseline schedule, right? So when you end up in a dispute, they're going to go against the
All the way
original
back to that
baseline.
first one.
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course. And
absolutely.
then they're not going to recognize certain things. So if you're changing a schedule and it's constantly evolving, then it's not going to help, you know, your case, your company to defend yourself against these impacts because it's not going to be recognized as
Yeah.
contractually, correct, right? So already you're
Yeah.
outside of your contractual obligation.
Yeah. And you mentioned Sarbanes-Oxley and uh, one thing I found is as the projects got bigger and as the projects got big enough that they would affect the company's financials, right? I mean, if you had a change in one of those giga projects, right, that's a big deal,
Mm-hmm.
And it got to the point that uh, management would say, "Don't tell me, because once you tell me, then I've got to immediately run to Wall Street and tell them this. So
Right.
don't ask for a budget supplement, for example, until you absolutely positively know what the answer is. If you
So,
can figure out some way to muddle through and shuffle the money around so you can keep the project going, don't tell me because of Sarbanes-Oxley. That all of a sudden
right.
that the people became criminally liable personally, right?
Of course.
Under Sarbanes-Oxley, right?
And,
That's what it did. It made management of these Fortune 500 companies personally criminally liable for
right.
producing an incorrect report. And to me, that caused all sorts of issues in project control because you'd know something and it couldn't be pushed up the line. You
It's
know,
called it's called plausible deniability, right? So they
yeah,
have plausible
because
deniability.
it never made it to the
Yeah,
board. You know,
we
that
didn't
issue
know.
never made it to the board. We
We
didn't
didn't know.
know. You
We didn't know
know,
that was late. We
those
didn't know we were
bastards
overran.
down there on that project hid that from us. You know, whatever. But I mean, literally, I can remember people saying, "Look, we got when that law came out and they analyzed it, it was like, hey, we're changing the rules." You know, because I mean, when I worked for Bechtel. Uh, the basic rule in project control absolutely positively was no surprises, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you want a career term ending event, you hid a problem.
Mm-hmm.
You know, hope was not an acceptable solution to a problem,
Exactly.
right? You couldn't hope this was going to go away and we're not going to report it, because when it came out, that was career ending, right? And when I went on the owner's side, because of Sarbanes-Oxley, it was like, never surprise me.
Mm-hmm.
Don't do, don't be honest. Don't put that problem on the table, because if you put that problem on the table, then I got to do something about it.
Right.
And it was a complete change in a mentality when that
Uh-huh.
Sarbanes-Oxley came out, and very different. You know, very different.
Everybody was reactive from that when the results of all that. But
Yeah,
you
once
know,
they figured out what the results were, it was real difference in when issues were pushed all the way to the board. You know,
so back to the system errors. Let's go back to the P6 stuff. Um, I've documented at least 9 reasons why P6 shouldn't perform earned value.
okay.
But I want to hear your take and y'all's take, Jerry and Rich, whoever wants to chime in, feel free. Um, you know, besides the historical performance not preserved, even regardless of your stored period performance, the sawtooth doesn't apply because it's your curves are based on the baseline assigned, and you can only have one, right? Um, Systematically, there's a bunch of other reasons. I'd like to hear y'all's position on any of this, if you got any. If not,
Yeah.
I'll chime
Well, I
them in.
mean, on the issue of sawtooths and baselines, I mean, the way around that obviously was to dump data out to Excel and have
Of
multiple
course,
baselines you could measure before,
right.
after and before certain dates. I mean, there's workarounds, right? There's ways around it, but the issue of if you deleted activities, the scope and the history that went with it. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how you get around that one that easily, and the other issue of when I'm making changes to a schedule, if I'm adding new scope, you got to be real careful and add that in the future. You
Mm-hmm.
can't automatically say, hey, we just made this change and you're 3 months behind. We added a new whatever facility and you guys should have started it 3 months ago. So you're in trouble. I mean, you really got to push it out to the future and then see what that does to the end date. If that becomes the new critical path, that's a whole mentality, people have to be really thinking about it and really rigorous
Well,
when you're doing that,
that's one of my points. Is a lot of times people think a change is instantaneous, and then you log it into your schedule, and guess what? Now everybody's happy because your schedule included changes. Some of those changes take time to approve because of maybe there's some disagreement on who should pay for it, or that's an official change. Is it a trend? So you pass reporting periods. So over a period of 2-3 reporting periods, that change order finally got approved. But that's in retrospect now. You can't go unlock the baseline now and then add these in the past now. Now it looks like you're manipulating data
Yeah,
in the schedule, right?
in the schedule. You have
But
to be smart enough to add it in the future.
right.
And a lot of people don't catch on to what that's doing. Uh, and yeah, that to me, that's that modified or current performance measurement baseline. If you're going to do earned value, has to really be rigorously managed. You can't, I mean, to me, when the earned value people come out with the scope changes, trends, and then the new one, deviations. I don't know how X years ago they came out with that thing of deviations, and that deviations went into the budget and the forecast, right? Went on both sides of the equation. That was a useful thing, you know. But I still haven't seen software that handles that well. You know, I still haven't seen software that draws the deviations down off the allowances instead of taking it out of contingency, you know.
That lays
Right?
into the methodology, right? So that's one of
Yeah.
my other points is it's subject to interpretation of people that do that, because how do they include contingency or management reserve, and then some of that should expire if it surpasses, and they don't, they try and preserve it to the end so it doesn't draw down. So you end up in all these different points of perspective of depending who's managing the project on how they're going to handle that.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's to me, that's a big deal. I mean, you want to be visible. One of the things I've seen people do that's really bad is they do lots of budget transfers, right? I got a little fat over here, so I'm going to take some of that budget over there and I'm going to use it over here. And what happens when you do that is that budget transfer is a zero sum, right? So that change essentially disappears in the change log. When I want to add up all the reasons for change, that one disappeared because it was just a budget. I covered that issue with a budget transfer. And
right.
what
If you
you
don't,
got people doing that, and all of a sudden you have no audit trail on your, well, this budget for this scope went from X to Y. Where'd the
right.
money come from? Oh, well, it was a budget transfer. And it
Seen that.
doesn't show up. So
That's
you
right.
got to be. You got to really be. It's not easy to manage that business.
Yeah, and that's to me, that's why the softwares like any of these ERP softwares are the platforms to be used for that, because they're more of an accounting and checks and balances kind of thing. You're doing all this in a schedule while you're moving a data date, while you're transitioning, and then you're going to try and retrospectively add and change and maneuver things. It's just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, when you're talking performance measurement baseline, something moving from one period to another in the PMB is a change, right? When some work moves. So not only are you talking about how big is that cost account, it's when are we doing it? So most people aren't capable of measuring both of those things. I mean, it's not only am I measuring how big is this activity, it moved.
Right.
From this year to next year, or this reporting period to that reporting period. And that whole traceability gets lost. I mean, there's no management of change process that, unless you're really, really looking at it, that pops up and says, hey, something's going on in cost account X. It's moving. And that's why if you have it in the ERP, it's fixed, and when it gets out of whack with the schedule, all of a sudden you realize something's going on. I gotta change.
Yeah.
So but that's a whole nother level of change management. The timing of the expenditures. Most people don't do that very well.
Yeah. All right. So we've got a wrap up. We've got to wrap this up, and appreciate you guys coming on, sharing your knowledge and experience and history. And we've got plenty more subject to talk about in the near future. So stay tuned. We're going to talk about more stuff, and we'll see y'all on the next one.
It was great as always.